It was the kind of morning that bites your bones, a cold spring dawn when the sky over Laramie turns the color of an old iron skillet. I was uncrating stock in front of the mercantile when I noticed the stillness. Usually by that hour you'd hear the blacksmith's hammer or some drunk still singing, but it was quiet, like the whole town had decided to hold its breath. That's when I saw them. 6 plain pine coffins, new built, sitting in a perfect row on the boardwalk right in front of the Laramie Bank and Trust. No one near them. No wagon tracks in the mud that hadn't been there the night before. Each lid had a name carved deep into the wood, not painted, but cut with the kind of patient knife work that takes time. I recognized every name: Curtis Harlan, Buck Larson, Wade Briggs, Cole Whitmore, Jeb Maddox, and the last one, Silas Rook, the banker's own name, carved as plain as the others. I wasn't the only one who saw. By the time I crossed the street, a small crowd had gathered and wasn't getting any closer. People stood with their hands in their pockets, looking at the coffins and then at each other, and nobody said a word. You could feel the question hanging in the air. Who built these? And why did they put a banker's name beside the names of known rustlers? Silas Rook came barreling out of the bank about 10 minutes later, still buttoning his vest, a cigar clamped between his teeth. He was a thick man with a thick voice, and he started barking at the tellers before he saw what we were all looking at. When his eyes landed on that row of pine boxes, he stopped. The cigar went still. I watched him walk slowly along the boardwalk, reading each name, and when he got to the one that said Silas Rook, his face changed. Not scared, exactly. More like a man who's just discovered a new kind of problem he didn't know existed. He turned to his clerk, a skinny kid named Vernon, and said something low. Vernon ran off toward the livery, and I knew he was heading for the Canyon Road, the place where Curtis Harlan and his boys camped when they weren't out rustling cattle for Rook's little land grab operation. The bank was planning to auction off the Hargreaves place tomorrow. Something about a debt nobody in town believed was real, and Harlan's crew had been in town 3 days already, making sure nobody got any ideas about helping the widow. That's when the mountain man walked into the bank. I hadn't seen him ride in, but there he was, stepping off a dark brown horse that looked like it had crossed half the territory without stopping. He was tall and built like a man who sleeps on the ground more often than in a bed, with a full dark beard and eyes that moved slow but didn't miss a thing. He wore a beige cowboy hat, not new but clean, and around his throat was a bandana, bright red, the kind of color that makes you look twice. A dark gray vest over a light shirt, a brown leather gun belt, and in his hand a lever-action rifle with a stock worn smooth at the grip. He tied the horse to the rail with a knot that took him maybe 2 seconds, but I could tell it wasn't coming undone until he wanted it to. Then he pushed through the bank's double doors like he owned the place. I followed, because I had to know what a man like that would do in a bank, where the manager had just seen his own name on a coffin. Inside, it was cool and smelled of ink and floor polish. The mountain man didn't look at the coffins outside. He didn't look at Rook, who had come back in and was standing behind the teller cage, sweating through his collar. He walked straight to the counter clerk, a woman named Nora Gale, Rook's bookkeeper, who flinched like she expected gunfire. And he set a coin on the wood. "Coffee," he said. "Black." Nora stared at him, then at Rook. Rook nodded, a tight little jerk of his chin. Nora poured the coffee from the pot she kept on the iron stove. The mountain man took it, leaned his back against the wall by the window, and drank slowly. He didn't seem to be in any hurry. Rook sent Vernon out again, this time with a hard look. I could see the message plain. Find Harlan, and find him fast. The clerk rode out at a gallop, and the crowd on the boardwalk watched him go. The coffin sat there in the sun, and the names carved into the lids seemed to get darker as the light grew stronger. The mountain man finished his coffee and set the empty cup on the teller counter. He still hadn't spoken another word. He just stood there wiping his mouth with the back of his hand and looked out of the window toward the east road, as if he was waiting for something too. Vernon came back half an hour later, alone. I saw him ride up slow, leading his horse now, not riding it. His face was white as flour. He walked into the bank, went straight to Rook, and whispered something that made the banker's hand stop moving on the desk. Rook looked at the mountain man, then at the window, then back at the clerk. Whatever the news was, it wasn't that Harlan was on his way. The backup wasn't coming. The mountain man didn't smile. He just picked up his rifle from where he'd propped it against the wall, stepped past the silent crowd outside, and untied his horse with that same careful knot. He swung up into the saddle and sat there for a long moment, looking at the row of coffins. Then he turned his horse north, toward the high country, and rode out of town the same way he'd come, without a name, without a hurry, and without a single word of explanation. Back inside the bank, Silas Rook was still standing behind the desk, staring at nothing. The 6 coffins sat outside, and the 6th one still had his name on it. And me? I stood there in the street with my hands in my pockets, wondering how a man could carve 6 names into pine wood and make an entire town of tough people hold its breath just by ordering a cup of coffee. The day was just getting started, and nothing felt the same as it had an hour before. I watched him ride out, that stranger, with his red bandana fading into the glare, and I figured that was the end of it. Most men who built coffins and left them on the bank's porch would ride away and never come back. That's what I told myself as I went back to my crates. But I kept thinking about those carved names and about the widow Hargreaves, whose ranch was going up for auction the next day. The thing about Laramie is, it's a small town. Everyone knows everyone's business, and nobody talks much. So when that mountain man came riding back in that same afternoon from the north, his horse worked hard, but not blown. I wasn't the only one who noticed. He didn't go to the saloon. He didn't go to the bank. He turned his horse down the dusty track that led out toward the widow's place, and I, like a fool, followed. I didn't go up to the house. I stopped my cart 100 yards off, at the bend where you can see the front porch. The stranger was already there, off his horse, standing by the wooden steps, talking to Clara Hargreaves. She had the door open, but not wide, like she wasn't sure if he was there to hurt her or help her. I saw him hand her something, a paper. She looked at it, then at him, and something in her shoulders shifted. He said something I couldn't hear, and she nodded. And for the first time in weeks, she looked like a woman who wasn't just waiting for the blow to land. That paper, I learned later, was her husband's original settlement receipt. The stranger had spent the ride north thinking about the debts, and he'd stopped at the land office before they closed. The clerk there, a nervous man named Joseph Watt, had shown him the bank's claim, a $700 debt with 40% monthly interest, compounded over 2 years, making the total nearly 10 times the original. But Watt also let slip that he'd seen the same kind of paperwork on 10 other ranches in the valley, all owned by families who'd been doing fine until Silas Rook started sending notices. That's when the mountain man started walking. He went from one farm to the next, not with a gun, but with a quiet question. Do you have the receipt from when you paid it off? Most of them did, stuffed in old coffee cans or folded in family Bibles. Each one had paid a small debt years ago, and Rook's bank had simply lost the record and been charging 40% on nothing ever since. 11 families, 11 false debts, all of them with an auction date hanging over their heads, and Curtis Harlan's rustlers, making sure nobody got bold enough to challenge it. When the stranger got back to town after dark, he didn't stop at the hotel. He went to the bank. It was locked up tight, but he walked around back and rapped on the window of the little back office where Nora Gale, the bookkeeper, was working late. Nora had been with the bank for 5 years, and she was the kind of woman who kept her head down and her accounts perfect. But she'd also been carrying a weight. She let him in. And what happened in that office I only heard about later from her directly. He didn't threaten her. He just set down all those old receipts, one by one, and asked if the bank's ledgers matched. She looked at the pile, and then she looked at him for a long time, and something in her face changed. She told him to wait. She walked 2 blocks to her little house, pulled up a loose floorboard in the kitchen, and came back with a thick leather-bound book. She'd been copying the true accounts for 3 years, waiting for someone to ask. The real debt on the Hargreaves place? $20? On all 11 ranches combined? A couple hundred, at most. The rest was ink and greed. I didn't know any of this yet as I stood by that bend in the road, watching the stranger ride back toward town after dark, his silhouette sharp against the last orange of the sky. But I knew one thing. That man wasn't leaving Laramie until the math was settled. And for Silas Rook, that was going to be a very hard kind of arithmetic. The next morning, word spread fast that the stranger hadn't slept at the hotel. I saw him ride out at first light, heading south toward the Cheyenne Road, with a leather book tucked inside his coat, the ledger Nora had given him. He didn't look back. I kept that to myself. Most folks didn't notice him leave. They were too busy watching the bank. Silas Rook spent the morning pacing behind those tall windows. Around noon, he called for Curtis Harlan and 3 other men, the ones whose names were still on those coffins. I saw them gather by the livery, talking low, then head straight for the hotel. I followed at a distance, curious. They kicked in the door of room 3 where the stranger had booked a bed, but never used it. I heard boots on the floorboards, drawers yanked open, a mattress flipped, then quiet. Harlan came back down the stairs holding a piece of paper, his face twisted like he'd bit into a rotten apple. He shoved the note at one of his men and stomped across the street to the bank. I edged closer and caught a glimpse over someone's shoulder. The note was short, wrote in a steady hand. "The ledger is already in Cheyenne." That was all. No signature. Just that one sentence. And it landed like a thunderclap. I watched through the bank window as Rook read it, his cigar going dead in his mouth. He'd sent men to crush a problem, and instead he'd found proof that the problem had already moved beyond his reach. The whole town felt the shift. The auction scheduled for tomorrow suddenly looked like a bad bet for the banker. Harlan started yelling, but Rook just stood there, the note trembling in his fist. Then he looked up and saw me watching, and a dozen others. The shield of local protection he'd built for years suddenly seemed paper-thin. The rest of that day felt like waiting for a storm to break. Rook holed up in the bank with the doors locked, his lawyer running between the jail and the telegraph office. The Coffins sat on the boardwalk untouched, and I noticed a few of the townsfolk crossing the street to walk on the opposite side rather than pass too close. No one said a word about what they'd seen that morning, but you could feel it in the air. Harlan's crew was either dead or scattered, and the man who'd built those boxes was somewhere between Cheyenne and here with the truth tucked inside his coat. I was sweeping the mercantile porch when I heard the hoofbeats, slow, unhurried, the sound of a horse that had traveled a long way and was in no mood to hurry the last mile. The mountain man came riding down Main Street as casual as a circuit preacher, the red bandana bright against the dull gray sky, that lever-action rifle angled across his saddle. He didn't glance at the bank. He just swung down at the livery, paid the hostler, and walked straight toward the bank's front door without looking at anyone. Something about the way he moved told every person on that street that whatever was about to happen was already a done deal. I left my broom and followed. The bank was open again, though the teller cage was empty. Vernon had vanished earlier. The only soul inside was Rook, standing like a statue behind his big oak desk, and Nora Gale at her little side table, her hands folded on a stack of papers. She didn't look scared. She looked like a woman who'd just laid down a heavy load. The mountain man stopped 2 paces from the desk and pulled a leather-bound book out of his coat, the same one Nora had carried from her house. He set it on the polished wood between them, then laid a single sheet of paper on top of it, Nora's handwriting neat and clear. He didn't speak. He just waited. Rook looked at the ledger and the affidavit like a man staring at his own tombstone. For a long moment, the only sound was the tick of the clock on the wall and the muffled murmur of the crowd outside pressing closer. Then Rook found his voice. "That's a private bank ledger, and I'll have you arrested for theft. I've got a territorial injunction from Judge Marsh this morning. Any interference with bank business will land you in the territorial jail before sundown." He pulled a folded document from his vest pocket, stamped and ribboned, and slapped it down beside the ledger. The mountain man didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the injunction. "That judge's paper works inside the territory," he said, his voice level and low. "But it don't reach Cheyenne. The federal banking examiner has a copy of this ledger and Miss Gale's sworn statement. They went out on the morning stage. That man operates under the Federal Banking Act of 1878, which says any bank chartered under territorial law has to keep honest accounts or lose the charter. You can waive that injunction all day, but it won't stop a federal examiner from asking one simple question. Why'd your book say these folks owe $700 when the real debt was $20? Rook's hand, still resting on the injunction, went slack. The ribbon crinkled. I watched the color drain from his face in stages, first the ears, then the cheeks, leaving him the color of old dough. He opened his mouth, then shut it. And for the first time in all the years I'd known him, Silas Rook had nothing to say. Nora spoke then, quiet but steady. "I'll testify to every entry. 3 years of it." Rook looked at her like he was seeing a ghost, but she met his eyes and didn't look away. The mountain man picked up his rifle from where he'd leaned it against the desk. He didn't aim it. He just cradled it in the crook of his arm and turned to go, pausing at the door. "The examiner will be here tomorrow morning. I'd suggest having your affairs in order by then." He pushed through the door, and I saw the crowd part for him like water around a stone. Rook was still standing behind his desk, the federal flag on the wall behind him, his precious injunction lying forgotten. The local shield he'd spent years building turned out to be made of paper, and the man from the high country had just shown everyone in Laramie that some authorities answer to a bigger piece of paper than any judge can sign. The federal examiner arrived on the morning stage, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a leather satchel that held more authority than any gun. He spent 2 hours in the bank with Nora Gale and the ledger, and by noon, Silas Rook walked out with his hat in his hand and his face the color of old flour. The bank's charter was revoked on the spot. Every fraudulent debt wiped clean, and all 11 families got word that their ranches weren't going anywhere. I was standing on the boardwalk when Clara Hargreaves heard the news. She didn't cry, didn't shout. She just stood in the sunlight and closed her eyes for a moment, and I think she was the quietest happy I've ever seen. The mountain man was there too, leaning against a post with his rifle across his arm. He didn't smile. He just watched the crowd, and when the cheering started, he walked into the bank one last time. I followed him inside. The place was empty now, except for the examiner and Nora, who was sorting papers. The mountain man set a $20 gold piece on the counter and said, "That's for the Hargreaves place, the real debt." Then he turned and walked out before anyone could thank him. I caught up with him at the livery, where he was tightening that same careful knot on his saddle. I asked him what happened to Harlan and his boys. He didn't look at me. "They chose the road," he said. That was all. Later, though, Clara told me what he'd told her, that he'd waited for them on the creek road, that he'd given them a chance to ride away, and that when they came at him anyway, he'd handled it. The last one, the leader, had thrown his gun down and tried to talk his way out of it. The mountain man had looked at him and spoken the words that I heard Clara repeat like a prayer. "Don't bother begging. My rifle doesn't listen to reason." And that was the end of Curtis Harlan. The Coffins disappeared sometime that afternoon. Some say the mountain man burned them behind the livery. Others say the townsfolk carried them off to bury the rustlers. I never did find out for sure. By evening, the examiner had finished his report, and 11 families were sleeping on land that actually belonged to them again. The mountain man rode north, and nobody in Laramie ever learned his name. We just remembered the red bandana and the quiet way he set things right. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.